Welcome to Chapter 7, Students with Autism Spectrum Disorders. So first, let's talk about what we mean by autism spectrum or ASD. In the medical world, there's several different categories that might fall under this broader category that we have in schools. Asperger's is no longer technically there, but people still use that term. RETS, childhood disintegrative disorder, persuasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified. In schools, those will all be housed under ASD. So what is ASD or autism? The American Psychological Association defines it as autism is a severe developmental disability characterized by an early age of onset, poor social development, impairments in language development, and rigidity in behavior. IDEA classifies it as a developmental disability significantly affecting verbal and nonverbal communication and social interaction, generally evident before age 3, that adversely affects a child's educational performance. Other characteristics often associated with autism are engagement in repetitive activities and stereotyped movements, resistance to environmental change or change in daily routine, and unusual sensory experiences. In Oregon, students need to have deficits in all 4 areas to qualify as a student with ASD. So they have to have communication deficits, they have to have social deficits, they have to have sensory deficits, and they have to have those restrictive, repetitive. Other states might be a little bit less stringent. I know when I was in California, they didn't have to have deficits in all 4 areas. And so because of that, you'll have students that move in and do some different things that then won't qualify in Oregon. Our school-based definition is more stringent than the medical model and some other states. Okay. So Asperger's, which again we don't technically have anymore, is we've now talk about autism in terms of level of support. It's still kind of a good distinction and shows that autism really is a spectrum. And with Asperger's, what's the difference really is the communication deficits aren't there to the same degree. Now, where the communication deficits do come in are often social communication. So in terms of schools, they still have to meet those 4 areas of deficit in Oregon, and one of them is communication. But oftentimes, it's their pragmatic or social communication where they'll have those deficits. We'll see the restrictive patterns of behaviors and interests, and we'll see as well the social impact. Sometimes with Asperger's, the other thing that's harder and sometimes a little trickier to see, because in Oregon we also have to have impairments in sensory, and some students who are higher functioning don't have as many sensory deficits as other students. So typical characteristics of autism spectrum: significant limitations in expressive and receptive language, difficulty with social reciprocity, repetitive, stereotypical, and ritualistic behaviors. Students with Asperger's have similar but less severe problems, and in this case, now with the DSM-5, we'll talk about different levels of support that's needed. So students who need a level 1 of support or a limited level of support are what we would talk about in terms of Asperger's. Approximately 5% of all students with disabilities have ASD. 4 times as many boys as girls have ASD, and half spend more than 40% of their time in the general education classroom. So again, it's really hard to have typical characteristics because it's such a spectrum. So in terms of a pause and reflect, do you believe that such characteristics as resistance to change and repetitive actions prohibit students with ASD from placements in inclusive classrooms? Why or why not? What strategies can teachers use to assist students with unexpected changes that frequently occur in the classroom? So again, a lot of gen ed classrooms, lots of things going on, the schedule changes. What are some things as a gen ed teacher that you can do to help students for whom those changes are difficult? Identification of students with autism. Now again, since a lot of times students with more significant disabilities, they're going to be identified early on. So pediatricians, neurologists, psychiatrists. In schools, we usually do a multidisciplinary assessment. A speech and language pathologist will do the functional communication portion. School psychologists often do communication as well as rating scales. We might have an autism specialist do something called an ADOS, which is an autism diagnostic. It's an interactive assessment where you set up situations and then see how a child reacts to it. So it's kind of like a structured observation. So, for example, one of the things you do in that when you're giving the ADOS is you kind of make these hanging comments like, oh, I have a favorite movie. And then you don't go on, and then you see if the student is able to say, so what is your favorite movie, or what movie do you like? Those types of things. And depending on the age level, you'll do different things. So in some places, they'll also have an occupational therapist as part of the multidisciplinary team to look at sensory processing because they're experts in that. A huge part of an ASD evaluation is that developmental history, because again, we're looking at when did language develop and those types of things, as well as trying to rule out other things. Probably one of the biggest overlaps that we see in terms of ASD evaluations are students with fetal alcohol syndrome. And of course, a lot of times that might not be alcohol, but students who had meth exposure in utero will often later kind of present as a student with ASD. So we really do a thorough developmental history to kind of weed out what it might be. And then another portion of this evaluation, and as gen ed teachers, some things you'll see, we'll conduct like 3 observations and have you fill out rating scales and those types of things. Pause and reflect. In the past few years, media portrayals of individuals with ASD have increased considerably. Have these media accounts impacted how students with the disability are identified, welcomed, and educated in inclusive school environments? If so, has the impact been predominantly positive or negative? Why are more children and youth being identified with ASD? Do you think that we're in the midst of an autism epidemic? Major characteristics of students with ASD. Communication skills. Approximately half don't acquire functional language. Many are nonverbal, or they'll just repeat what is said to them. Infrequent use of gestures and eye contact, as well as sharing attention. So how we look for this, for example, on the ADOS is we'll say, oh, look over there, and we'll kind of move our eyes and see if the students will look. That's shared attention. Eye contact, are they able to maintain it in a comfortable way? And then gestures, as they're speaking and talking, do they use gestures to enhance the understanding of the person that they're talking to? A lot of times we've got assistive technology, pictures and symbols, communication boards, and as we've gone along, it's really great because there's so many more technology aspects to help with communication. Students with Asperger's disorder have difficulty with figurative language and pragmatics. So if you say, let's get into the swing of things, they think you're really going to be swinging, those types of things. Some students may use sign language. And this is an interesting piece. I was just working on a case this year where we were trying to figure out sign language versus other forms of communication. And the problem with sign language is that we can teach the family and we can teach the student sign language, But in terms of being able to communicate with the general population, if they can use assistive technology on their iPhone that then they can take with them, that allows them to talk to a lot more people. Okay. Social reciprocity, they have a reduced ability in understanding the rules that govern social exchanges. So some of those non-written social rules are going to be very difficult for them to figure out. May seem oblivious to the feelings and thoughts of others. I was working with a woman, an adult woman, who is told often by people that she's rude, and she's not trying to be rude. But it's just that she can't read those thoughts and feelings of others, and read those facial expressions of others, or pick up on those subtle clues that people want to stop talking, for example, and so she doesn't stop talking. May not respond to familiar faces and appear aloof. Students with Asperger's tend to be blunt and rigid with awkward exchanges. Repetitive, stereotypical, and ritualistic behaviors. High frequency motor behaviors, flapping, rocking, those types of things. Clinging to certain objects. I knew a student who wouldn't go anywhere without a piece of string. Sensory stimuli reactions. It might be lights, it could be sound, it could be clothing on skin. Sometimes it's things like liquid dish soap. They won't want on their hands. They don't want their hands sticky. It can look a lot of different ways. But at the same time, one thing that we have to remember about these disorders is that we all have some of these a little bit. Like a tag in my clothing can drive me nuts sometimes too, right? And there's certain fabrics that we might like and not like. So we all have some sensory stimuli reactions, and it's just trying to figure out, okay, when does it cross that threshold to be, okay, this is now a problem and it's impacting their functioning. Students with Asperger's tend to have intense interests. You see a lot of interest in things like Minecraft. Trains, of course, have not gone out of style. And so they'll learn and want to talk about, they can talk really well to you if you're talking about their area of interest. But when you start talking about other areas of interest, then that becomes more difficult. Those areas of interest can be used for things like rewards and those types of things. In terms of cognitive characteristics of students with autism spectrum, this is really hard to classify because, again, the range, right? You've got students with superior IQs that are on the spectrum, as well as those that are profoundly intellectually delayed. So, this is where that range comes in again. Students with higher IQs are less likely to exhibit gross deficits in social interaction and emotional expression, inappropriate play, self-injurious behavior, and delays in motor and language development. So those that have higher cognitive scores will have higher functioning overall. Many students with ASD have difficulty remembering and organizing information, and some of those executive functioning and planning pieces can be missing. And this is where a lot of times students will get referred for autism spectrum and ADHD at the same time. Because of some of those executive functioning things. And it's really the ASD, they don't necessarily need another label of ADHD, but a lot of times we'll see these concurrent evaluations for autism and as well as ADHD. And it's some of that planning, organization, and executive functioning that they might have difficulty with. So, secondary characteristics with students with ASD, age of onset. So students with autism spectrum often are identified below the age of 3. So these are students who are more impacted, whereas students who are higher functioning, what used to be called the Asperger's category, typically diagnosed more around the age of 11, when those social interactions, the subtlety of social interactions become more prevalent. When they're young, right at preschool, it's common to see parallel plays, 2 kids playing next to each other but not with each other. But as the social rules become more complex, then those students that have difficulty with those rules stick out a little bit more. Self-injurious behavior can be an area of difficulty. Students with ASD are typically identified. Oh, sorry, I skipped back up. Talk about organization and executive functioning. So self-injurious behavior can be an area of really difficulty, head banging, and sometimes these things happen, until the point of significant injury. Head banging, punching, scratching, biting. Elimination of this behavior is obviously a high priority. Sometimes until we can eliminate it, all we can do is try to lessen the impact it has on them. For example, a helmet, those types of things, so that when they do engage in the self-injurious behavior, that they're not injuring themselves as much. Not quite sure why this is so prevalent, but possibly an attempt to reduce environmental stimuli. And this is why, again, students will often get referred for ADHD as well, is because too much overstimulation with students with autism can as well be an issue. And that's another one of those features that overlaps with ADHD, and why it can be hard for people to figure out, okay, is this autism or is this ADHD? So teaching students with ASD in the classroom, understand that student behaviors communicate needs and feelings. Prompt attention and establish eye contact. Be flexible and provide accommodations. Understand and engage parents. That parent communication can be key, figuring out what works well for them, what can you work, how can you try some of those strategies in school as well. Things like eye contact, prompting attention, making sure they have your attention. Some other things that you'll want to work on are not just modeling that behavior, but again, being explicit about what the social rules are. For those students with Asperger's, you can do things like social stories where you can talk to them about what's going to happen. If you're going to go on a field trip, those types of things, you'll want to have really explicitly said, this is how the day is going to go, and this is what it's going to look like, and this is what your responsibilities are going to be. Oftentimes, warning both the student and the parent when a change is going to happen is key. A lot of times when things go awry are when students have like substitute teachers and those types of things. So you really want to connect well with the substitutes, let parents know if there's going to be a substitute if you can, those types of things, so they can prompt the student. Okay. So one of the difficult things is that students with ASD often have speech and language services, they may have OT services, the special ed teachers, and you're all trying to come up with a plan. So time is a major factor confronting collaborative teams. How can teams make time for collaborative planning when members do not have a common planning time? And that can be particularly difficult because people like your speech and language pathologists might only work at an elementary school 3 days a week, something like that. So how can you have this strong collaborative team when you don't have common planning time? Many students with ASD have problems with verbal and nonverbal communication. Should all teachers be required to develop competencies in alternative augmentative communication to better assist these students in improving their communication skills? Can you think of how universally designed portable electronic devices, for example, Palm Pilots, iPods, etc., can be adapted for use to benefit students with ASD? Maintaining family involvement in transition planning and instructional activities is essential to the post-school success of students with ASD. What specific actions can teachers take to encourage and support family participation in transition planning? One note on family participation. At some point in time, often siblings will take over the care because parents will no longer be able to do that. as their children with significant needs will outlive them. So trying to figure out an appropriate way of encouraging sibling involvement in a way that doesn't overburden siblings too early, but siblings ultimately, often at some point in time in the developmental spectrum, will be the ones taking care of their siblings. Maybe not directly, but they'll still have to be the overall seer and managing of their care if somebody else is implementing it. Okay, thank you.